And Paul is going to tell us a little bit about how he uses his technology to look after his clients.
Sure. I come from a rather unique perspective because as a contract furniture dealership, we actually don't deal with BIM per se. We don't actually deal with Revit. What we use is we use a piece of technology from a company that's called CET Designer, made by a company called Configure. And essentially I call it pseudo-BIM, quasi-BIM. It's got, it operates on a principle called parametric graphic calculation and configuration. So essentially the software recognizes the interrelation, the correlation between specific parts and pieces you're putting together and completes that junction for you. So if you put, say for instance, electrical into a panel, it's going to immediately know to put the proper connectors in. It's going to be 3+1 power, or it's going to be 3+2, or it's going to be 2+2, or whatever, and it's going to fill in those parameters for you. So what this has enabled us to do is design entire floor plans in record time. But, you know, turnover market is incredibly fast. We do real-time 2D design, real-time 3D design. It's building those 3D models as you're building the 2D plan. From a facilities point of view, the really interesting thing is, as it's doing this, it's also building the full specifications. So when we're designing a floor plan for, say, a large municipal client, we're actually building all the specs and we're doing all that specification within the program itself. Back in what I call the dark ages, which was about 5 years ago, when we were just using CAD. CAD, of course, from a furniture manufacturer's perspective, is a very static object. It's a very static environment. You're dealing specifically in, you know, rectangular or round shapes. There's not a lot of inherent intelligence within those objects from the furniture manufacturers. This was the game changer within our industry now. So you're seeing this. Most of the major manufacturers in North America have moved to this modeling. So Steelcase is on it, Techion's on it, Hayworth is on it. Other manufacturers are on something comparable through ICE, which of course is an offshoot of the Dirt Corporation. So for our perspective, as we're building these models and as we're building these floor plans, we're building the specification. What it allows us to do is when we get into a situation where, you know, let's face it, we're kind of like the last kid on the playground when it comes to a building. We're kind of like, you know, everything's done before we walk in, and then everybody goes, oh right, we need furniture. Okay, let's get that in. So we're kind of like the last ones in, and then when the reconfiguration happens, we're the first one that everybody turns around and comes to for updated plans. So we're in kind of a unique perspective there, because what the software allows us to do is to take the final finished product, the building, the inherent electrical component system within the building, the furniture as it's related to the electrical system, and retain that intelligence and that reconfigurability of those parts and pieces, and create a database comparison model. So as for facilities managers and department heads and things like that come back to us as a supplier and say, we need to reconfigure this department, we're reconfiguring this area, we're putting a new team together, we're vacating this floor, we're going to sublease this quadrant, we can actually take those component parts and pieces, reconfigure them in any way that they want, because we have that inherent intelligence within the objects themselves. So there's really kind of a multi-tiered aspect. This is why I kind of call it BIM light or quasi-BIM, is because it does have inherent intelligence in the objects that allows us to kind of extrapolate and do a lot more now than we could 5 years ago when we were just dealing with static CAD objects, essentially. The problem is, actually, can you go back one?
Yes.
We have the technology.
So, oh, perfect, all right. So this is kind of a standard 3D with the parametrics in the corner that allow us to kind of specify as we're doing design on the fly in front of the client. The next slide kind of shows you the overall floor plan that we're looking at in a 2D, 3D modeling environment. But the third one, this is where things really get interesting. This was a recent municipal project that I was involved with, and this is not typically how our floor plan turns out. Our floor plan is usually nice and very clean. It's got all the tag and all the furniture and everything up. But what we're finding now, because furniture is no longer just call your local manufacturer, hey, I need some panels, hey, I need some work surfaces, it shows up 6 weeks later, you snap it in, and it's done. Now we're getting to the point where our systems are starting to get incorporated earlier into the building systems. We're starting to be influenced by raised floor, by electrical box placements, by things that, if it's not done right up in front, then it's going to wind up being a massive amount of change orders later down the road, and it's going to wind up being a big schmozzle on site, and it's going to lead to site delays, and it's going to lead to occupancy permit issues and a whole bunch of other variants and things. So in an instance like this, all the giant red and green lines that you see on here were things that we had to deal with our demountable wall system. It was things like condensate pipes, it was things like air exchange vents and stuff like that. Stuff that we now have to take into account with our product whenever we're installing it on site. It's no longer just throw a panel in now, especially when you're dealing with steel-cased demountable walls or dirt, you're dealing with interfaces within a lot of building services. So, go to the next slide. For instance, our mini ends and our wall system have to do things like notch-around beams like this. This is where BIM would really help us as a manufacturer, and this is why I've been waiting for years for BIM to really take off in Vancouver and become kind of our industry standard. A lot of people right now are just kind of treating it like an offshoot CAD, essentially. Stuff like this could have been avoided way earlier in the process. And because we have this parametric graphic calculation inherent in the software that we use now, a lot of that intelligence is already inherent in the parts and pieces that we use. So I mean, this was just one instance of an issue we had on site. There we're looking at air exchangers that are ducting through our infill. You know, so when we get into issues like this where it's stuff that's not realized early up in the process, and it's not something it's something that would have been captured on a BIM model, but it's not captured on a CAD specific model unless you start stripping layers out, you start looking at specific details. A lot of the time we're going to get on site and we're going to find that, you know, CAD is CAD and the real world is the real world. Guys get in on site, what was necessarily done on the CAD isn't really the way that it's going to turn out when you're actually building the building. So we're going to get on site and find, oh, well, that's actually moved. Now we've got to deal with a change order. Now we've got to deal with a delay on site. Now we've got to deal with this is wrong, that's wrong, this needs to be adjusted, that needs to be adjusted. Labor rates go up, extra time on site, extra crews, et cetera, et cetera. So from our perspective, when you're looking at a ceiling and you're seeing all this stuff and you're kind of going, you know, that could have been avoided and that could have been avoided and that could have been avoided. The future for us really is the incorporation of BIM into all systems within the building modeling in Vancouver. It's not just about Casey doing it, it's not just about mechanical and electrical contractors doing it, it's about that process being extrapolated across all manufacturers, all systems that are actually touching the building, including furniture. Because quite honestly, we're not just the guys who kind of come in and throw a few work surfaces at the end of it now. Now, especially with things like ASHRAE, 90.1, where we're starting to look at, electrical components being controlled, workstations and sensory, occupancy, sensors and things like that. We're having to get involved in the process earlier and earlier. And that's something that, is kind of a sea change for our industry. We're used to being the last kids on the playground. We're not used to having to be that far out of the process. So the BIM thing for us is a really unique opportunity because our mindset changed 5 years ago. We're kind of already sort of partially the way there. We're already used to looking for conflicts. We're used to validating drawings. We're used to kind of seeing where things are going to go and where possible errors could happen on site. Trying to stave off that issue that's going to be a year or a year and a half down the road. That's kind of where we are right now. It's kind of where BIM, we're